The tactical projection within the command spire of the dreadnought Vanguard of Sol flickered with the cold, mathematical certainty of extinction. Admiral Nathaniel Vance watched the holographic representation of the Oularian Hegemony's fleet as it transitioned from slipspace into the local gravity well of the Proxima Centauri shipyards. There were 12,000 vessels in the first wave alone, each a shimmering needle of crystalline alloy powered by vacuum energy reactors that outclassed human fission fusion hybrids by an order of magnitude. The Oularian ships didn't just move through space. They seemed to rewrite the laws of physics around them, slipping through the vacuum with a grace that made the bulky, reactive armor plating of the United Terran Mandate look like primitive relics of a forgotten industrial age. Nathaniel felt the subtle vibration of the deck plating beneath his boots, a rhythmic thrumming of the massive engines that had carried humanity across the narrow gap between stars, only to find a galaxy that viewed them as a biological infestation. The Oularian High Command had issued no formal declaration of war, for one does not declare war on a virus. They had simply arrived to sanitize the sector. Every sensor reading confirmed the same grim reality. The Terran fleet was outnumbered 10-1 and outgunned by a factor that defied conventional naval doctrine. Yet, as Nathaniel looked at the faces of his bridge crew, he didn't see the hollow stare of the condemned. He saw a focused, almost clinical intensity. Humanity had spent its entire history fighting against the odds, from the frozen tundras of the Pleistocene to the orbital sieges of the Unification Wars. They were a species built on the foundation of stubbornness, a race that viewed an impossible situation not as an end, but as a challenge to be dismantled. The lead Oularian vessel, a behemoth designated as a sovereign-class planet breaker, pulsed with a rhythmic violet light. This was the precursor to a tachyon burst, a weapon that could strip the atmosphere from a world or melt the hull of a battle station in seconds. Nathaniel keyed the fleet-wide transmission, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He didn't offer a grand oration or a poetic farewell. He gave them the only thing that mattered in the face of annihilation, an objective. He ordered the fleet into a staggered interlocking formation, a geometric defense designed to overlap point defense grids and create a saturated field of fire. The Vanguard of Sol led the charge, its massive kinetic accelerators humming as they spun up to maximum velocity. Unlike the Oularian energy weapons, human technology relied on the simple, brutal efficiency of mass and momentum. A slug of depleted uranium, traveling at 0.5% of the speed of light, carried a kinetic energy expressed by the formula EK equals \frac12 MV2. When thousands of these slugs were fired in a synchronized pattern, they created a wall of metal that no energy shield could fully dissipate. The first exchange of fire was a blinding spectacle of light and fury. The Oularian tachyon beams carved through the Terran escort frigates like hot wires through wax, vaporizing armor and crew in an instant. But the Terran counter-barrage was a physical storm. The crystalline hulls of the Oularian ships, designed to refract and absorb energy, shattered under the relentless impact of solid matter. The vacuum of space was suddenly filled with the debris of 1,000 shattered dreams, a glittering cloud of glass and steel that reflected the dying light of the Proxima Sun. Nathaniel watched as the indomitable Spirit, a heavy cruiser on his starboard flank, took a direct hit to its secondary reactor. The ship buckled, its midsection glowing white-hot as internal containment fields failed. But instead of drifting aimlessly or exploding, the crew of the Indomitable pushed their remaining engines to the breaking point. They didn't retreat, they accelerated. The damaged cruiser became a kinetic projectile of its own, slamming into an Oularian carrier with the force of a small moon. The resulting explosion was a silent, expanding sphere of white light that took 3 enemy escorts with it. This was the core of the human spirit that the hegemony had failed to calculate: the willingness to trade a single life for a strategic advantage, the refusal to accept a mathematical defeat when there was still a way to inflict damage. The Oularian hive mind, interconnected by a sophisticated neural web, felt a ripple of genuine confusion. Their simulations had predicted a Terran surrender within the first 20 minutes of engagement. They had anticipated fear, chaos, and a frantic attempt to flee. Instead, they found a species that fought with a cold, mechanical precision, turning their very deaths into weapons. On the bridge of the Vanguard, the tactical officer, a woman named Sarah Jenkins, who had lost her entire family in the initial Oularian bombardment of the Martian colonies, reported that the enemy's forward line was buckling. The Oularians were pulling back to regroup, their superior technology momentarily stymied by the sheer audacity of the human defense. Nathaniel knew this was only a temporary reprieve. The hegemony had millions of ships in reserve, and their industrial capacity spanned a dozen star systems. But for this moment, in this tiny corner of the galaxy, humanity had proven that iron and will could stand against the light of 1,000 suns. The battle raged for hours, a grueling war of attrition that tested the limits of human endurance and mechanical reliability. Every time an Oularian ship found a weakness in the Terran line, 3 more human vessels would move to plug the gap, their hulls scarred by radiation and pitted by micro-impacts. The air inside the Vanguard grew thick, with the smell of ozone and recycled oxygen, the life support systems struggling to keep pace with the damage. Nathaniel stayed at his post, his eyes locked on the tactical display, calculating trajectories and issuing orders that saved hundreds of lives with every breath. He saw the Oularian flagship repositioning, preparing for a final, decisive strike that would sweep the remaining Terran forces aside. It was a massive, multifaceted spire of obsidian-like material, surrounded by a swirling nebula of defensive drones. Nathaniel knew that if they couldn't take down that flagship, the shipyard and the millions of civilians hiding in the subterranean bunkers of Proxima IV would be lost. He ordered the Vanguard to break formation and head straight for the enemy center. It was a suicide run, a desperate gamble to get close enough to use the ship's experimental graviton beam. As the Vanguard charged, it was hit repeatedly, its shields failing and its outer hull peeling away in great ribbons of glowing metal. But the ship kept moving, propelled by the sheer determination of its crew and the engineering genius of a species that refused to die. When they were finally within range, Nathaniel gave the order to fire. The graviton beam was a ripple in the fabric of spacetime, a focused distortion that ignored conventional shields and tore directly at the structural integrity of the target. The Oularian flagship groaned under the unnatural stress, its crystalline lattices snapping and its internal atmosphere venting into the void. The great spire began to tilt, its power core fluctuating wildly before finally collapsing into a localized singularity. The destruction of the flagship sent a shockwave through the Oularian fleet. Their neural link, so long a source of strength and coordination, suddenly became a liability as the psychic backlash of the flagship's destruction rippled through every pilot and commander. The hegemony ships faltered, their movements becoming erratic and uncoordinated. Seizing the opportunity, the remaining Terran vessels launched a final, coordinated strike, hounding the retreating Oularian forces back toward the jump point. As the last of the enemy ships vanished into slipspace, a heavy, exhausted calm descended over the Vanguard. They had won the battle, but the cost was staggering. Half the fleet was gone, and the Vanguard itself was a drifting wreck, held together by little more than prayer and emergency sealant. Nathaniel slumped into his command chair, his hands shaking as the adrenaline began to fade. He looked out the viewing port at the debris field, a graveyard of ships that marked the first true victory of humanity against the hegemony. They were still outnumbered, still outgunned, and the war was far from over, but they had done the impossible. They had looked into the eyes of a superior god and made it blink. The hegemony would return, and they would return with greater force, but they would do so knowing that the inhabitants of this small, unremarkable star system were not a virus to be sanitized. They were a fire that refused to be extinguished, a resonance of iron and will that would echo across the stars until the very end of time. As the repair crews began their grim work and the wounded were ferried to the medical bays, Nathaniel thought about the future. The hegemony's mistake had been their reliance on logic and probability. They had calculated the strength of hulls and the yield of weapons, but they had ignored the intangible factors that defined the human condition. They hadn't accounted for the father who would fight to the death to protect his children, or the engineer who would stay at his post in a venting engine room to ensure the ship had one last burst of power. They hadn't understood that for humans, the concept of impossible was merely a starting point. The Admiral looked at the data scrolling across his console, the casualty lists, and the damage reports. It was a heavy burden, the weight of 1,000 lives lost in a few hours of combat. But he also saw the messages of hope coming from the surface of Proxima IV, the cheers of millions who had watched the battle from the ground and realized that they were not alone. Humanity had found its voice in the darkness, a defiant shout that rang out across the light years. They were no longer just a collection of colonies and nations. They were a united front, a single fist raised against the encroaching shadow. The road ahead would be long and filled with sacrifice, but as the Vanguard of Sol began its slow journey back to the dry docks, Nathaniel knew that they had already won the most important battle. They had proven to themselves and to the galaxy that they belonged. The Oularian Hegemony would spend months analyzing the data from the Proxima engagement, trying to find the flaw in their logic. They would look at the sensor logs and the debris patterns, searching for some secret weapon or hidden technology that could explain their defeat. They would find nothing but the remnants of standard-issue Terran equipment, the same mass drivers and fission reactors they had seen 1,000 times before. They would never find the true source of the human victory because it wasn't something that could be measured or scanned. It was the spark of creativity that led a pilot to use his ship as a ram, the bond of loyalty that kept a crew together when all hope was lost, and the sheer, unadulterated gall of a species that refused to know its place. While the hegemony pondered, humanity would be building. They would take the lessons learned at Proxima and apply them to every aspect of their defense. They would refine their tactics, upgrade their ships, and prepare for the next wave. They were no longer the prey, they were the hunters, waiting for the shadow to return so they could tear it apart. The resonance of iron and will had only just begun to sound, and it would grow louder with every passing day, a symphony of defiance that would eventually drown out the cold, silent logic of the hegemony. Nathaniel Vance closed his eyes for a brief moment, allowing himself to feel the exhaustion, but when he opened them again, his gaze was sharp and clear. There was work to be done. The repair drones swarmed over the hull of the Vanguard, their small laser welders flickering like fireflies against the dark backdrop of space. Inside the ship, the atmosphere was a mix of frantic activity and somber reflection. In the corridors, soldiers and technicians moved with purpose, their faces smeared with grease and soot, but their eyes bright with the fire of victory. They had survived the unsurvivable. They had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had flinched. Nathaniel walked through the ship, stopping to speak with the crews, offering a hand to the wounded and a word of encouragement to the weary. He saw the pride in their eyes, the realization that they were part of something much larger than themselves. This was the strength of humanity, not just the power of their weapons, but the power of their connection to one another. They were a species that thrived on community, that found strength in the shared struggle. The hegemony, with its cold hive mind, could never understand the individual passion that drove a human to greatness. They could coordinate 1,000,000 ships with perfect efficiency, but they could never inspire a single soul to go beyond the call of duty. By the time the Vanguard reached the inner docks, the sun of Proxima Centauri was beginning to rise over the curve of the planet, casting a long, golden shadow across the scarred hull of the ship. It was a beautiful sight, a reminder of the world they were fighting to protect. Nathaniel stood on the observation deck, watching the light dance across the clouds of Proxima IV. He thought about the billions of people on Earth, still unaware of how close they had come to destruction. He thought about the colonies on Mars and the Belt, all of them counting on the fleet to keep the darkness at bay. The responsibility was immense, but for the first time in his career, Nathaniel didn't feel the weight of it as a burden. He felt it as a privilege. He was the commander of the most resilient, most unpredictable, and most dangerous species in the galaxy. And he knew, with a certainty that no Oularian computer could ever replicate, that as long as there was a single human being left standing, the hegemony would never truly win. The resonance of iron and will was the heartbeat of a new era, and the galaxy was about to find out exactly what happens when you try to silence the human heart. In the depths of the shipyards, the sounds of industry were already beginning to drown out the echoes of the battle. New ships were being laid down, their frames rising from the dust of the old like the skeletons of titans. The lessons of Proxima were being etched into every plate of armor and every line of code. They would be faster, stronger, and more lethal than anything that had come before. They would be the instruments of a counter-offensive that would carry the war to the hegemony's own doorstep. The Oularians had thought they were dealing with a minor obstacle, a footnote in their grand history of conquest. They were about to realize that they had awakened a giant, a force of nature that would not stop until the threat was eliminated. The Admiral turned away from the window and headed back to the bridge. There were reports to file, strategies to develop, and a fleet to rebuild. The victory at Proxima was just the beginning. The real fight was still ahead, and Nathaniel Vance was ready to lead it. He knew the cost would be high, and he knew the path would be dangerous, but he also knew that humanity was ready. They had found their iron, and their will was unbreakable. The resonance would continue, a steady, pulsing beat that would guide them through the darkness and into the light of a new dawn. The aftermath of the engagement at Proxima Centauri left the United Terran Mandate in a state of hyper-accelerated evolution, a frantic shifting of gears that saw civilian industries dismantled and reborn as components of a singular military machine. Admiral Nathaniel Vance stood within the orbital command hub of the Sol system, a massive ring of pressurized steel and reinforced glass that encircled the moon of Luna like a crown of thorns. Below him, the lunar surface was a landscape of incandescent blue sparks and shifting shadows, as thousands of automated fabricators chewed through the crust to extract the silicates and ores necessary for the new fleet. The Oularian hegemony had retreated, but the silence they left behind was not a peace. It was a vacuum waiting to be filled by the next, more devastating wave of crystalline invaders. Nathaniel looked at the logistics displays, the cascading rivers of data representing the movement of millions of tons of refined tungsten, the synthesis of exotic antimatter, and the mobilization of every able-bodied citizen from the slums of Jakarta to the research domes of Europa. The hegemony fought with the cold efficiency of a hive mind, but humanity fought with the desperate, jagged energy of a species that had finally realized the floor of the universe was not solid. Every decision Nathaniel made was a calculation of time versus survival, a brutal accounting of how many hulls could be pressurized before the next jump signature was detected at the edge of the heliosphere. The transition to a total war footing had been seamless only because the alternative was total extinction, a realization that had dissolved centuries of political friction in the span of a single afternoon. The primary challenge was the disparity in power generation, a technical gap that the Mandate's finest minds were attempting to bridge through sheer, reckless experimentation. While the Oularian ships utilized vacuum energy siphons to pull power from the very fabric of space, human vessels still relied on the controlled annihilation of matter and antimatter, a process governed by the rigorous laws of thermodynamics. E equals mc2 was the master of their arsenal, but the heat dissipation required to manage such energies without melting the ship's own superstructure was a constant limiting factor. Nathaniel met with the lead engineers in the central foundry, a cavernous space where the skeleton of a new class of dreadnought, the Iron Sovereign, was being assembled. The lead architect, a man named Thomas Thorne, whose hands were permanently stained with the carbon dust of the shipyards, pointed to the massive cooling fins that lined the ship's dorsal spine. Thorne explained that to match the Oularian output, they were pushing their reactors to 120% of their rated capacity, relying on a new ceramic metal composite to prevent core breaches. It was a gamble of engineering, a design that favored raw output over safety margins, reflecting the broader philosophy of the Mandate. They were no longer building ships meant to last for decades of patrol. They were building instruments of localized destruction, intended to survive exactly long enough to deliver their payloads into the heart of the enemy formation. The mobilization was not limited to the physical hardware of war, for the psychological landscape of humanity had shifted as well. The internal sensors of the lunar hub picked up the constant hum of transport shuttles ferrying recruits to the training centers, where the survivors of the Proxima battle served as the new instructors. Nathaniel walked through the barracks, seeing the faces of men and women who had traded their futures for a chance to strike back at the crystalline giants. There was no talk of glory or the romanticism of the frontier. There was only the grim, methodical preparation of a species that had seen its gods bleed and realized it could kill them. The hegemony had underestimated the human capacity for adaptation, believing that their technological superiority would induce a state of paralysis or worship. Instead, they had triggered a primal defensive reflex, a collective hardening of the soul that turned poets into tacticians and teachers into precision strike specialists. Nathaniel spoke with a young pilot who was practicing with a new neural link interface, a technology that allowed a human brain to bypass the lag of physical controls and communicate directly with the ship's computer. The risk of synaptic burnout was high, the mental strain comparable to holding a live wire, yet the pilot's only concern was whether the link would allow him to outmaneuver the Oularian interceptors in the tight debris fields of the asteroid belt. As the weeks passed, the intelligence reports began to filter in from the long-range sensor buoys placed at the periphery of the system. The Oularians were not merely regrouping. They were constructing a localized jump gate, a massive ring of shifting geometry that would allow them to bypass the traditional slipspace lanes and emerge directly in the heart of the Sol system. The Mandate's tactical computers struggled to model the physics of the gate, as the Oularian method of travel seemed to involve the folding of higher dimensions that human mathematics was only beginning to describe. Nathaniel gathered his staff in the war room, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and the hum of high-powered processors. They mapped out a plan that was as audacious as it was dangerous, a preemptive strike against the construction site before the gate could be stabilized. This would require the fleet to jump into the middle of an active construction zone, surrounded by Oularian guardians and the unstable gravitational fluctuations of the gate itself. It was a mission that defied every principle of conservative naval engagement. But as Nathaniel pointed out to the dissenting voices, the Mandate did not have the luxury of a defensive war. If the Oularians opened a bridge to their home sectors, the sheer weight of their numbers would crush Earth beneath a mountain of crystalline hulls. The logistics of the strike were a nightmare of synchronization. To achieve the necessary surprise, the Terran fleet would have to use a series of gravity slingshots around the gas giants, masking their drive signatures against the massive radiation belts of Jupiter and Saturn. They would then execute a short-range microjump, a maneuver that tested the structural integrity of even the newest hulls. Nathaniel spent hours reviewing the fuel consumption charts and the ammunition manifests, ensuring that every ship carried enough kinetic slugs to saturate the target area. The Iron Sovereign would serve as the tip of the spear, its experimental reactors providing the power for a massive forward shield that would hopefully protect the following cruisers from the initial Oularian tachyon bursts. The Admiral felt the weight of every life he was about to risk, a pressure that sat in the pit of his stomach like cold lead. He knew that many of these ships would never return to the lunar docks, that their crews would become nothing more than ionized gas and drifting fragments of steel. But he also knew that the cost of inaction was the silence of a dead world. He looked at a holographic image of Earth, the blue-green marble that had birthed them all, and felt a surge of protective fury that drowned out the doubts of his rational mind. On the eve of the departure, Nathaniel received a private communication from the Martian colonial administrator, reporting that the civilian population had exceeded all production quotas for the month. Even the children in the habdomes were contributing, sorting through reclaimed scrap and assisting in the hydroponic gardens to free up adults for the factories. It was a total mobilization of a species, a phenomenon the Oularian hive mind would find incomprehensible. To the hegemony, an individual was a cell in a larger organism, easily replaced and lacking any agency of its own. To the Mandate, every individual was a conscious choice maker, a person who had looked at the threat of annihilation and decided to fight back. This diversity of thought was humanity's greatest weapon, allowing for a level of tactical unpredictability that no machine intelligence could fully counter. Nathaniel realized that the Oularians weren't just fighting a military, they were fighting a collective will that refused to be categorized or predicted. He felt a grim sense of pride as he watched the fleet begin to move, hundreds of ships detaching from their mooring pylons and igniting their fusion torches. The sky above the moon was filled with the artificial stars of 1,000 engines, a constellation of defiance that signaled the beginning of the counter-offensive. The transit through the outer system was a tense, silent journey. The ships ran dark, their sensors passive, and their communication arrays hushed. Inside the Iron Sovereign, Nathaniel walked the decks, observing the crew as they prepared for the jump. He saw a technician carefully calibrated a mass driver, his movements precise and practiced. He saw a group of Marines checking their vacuum suits, their faces obscured by the polarized visors of their helmets. There was an air of professional detachment, a focus on the task at hand that spoke of a deep-seated discipline. These were the children of a world that had always been a crucible, a place where life had to struggle for every breath of air and every drop of water. The Oularians had come from a world of perfect order and limitless resources, a paradise that had softened their resolve. Humanity was the product of a harsh, unforgiving world, and they brought that hardness with them into the void. As the fleet approached the jump point near the orbit of Neptune, Nathaniel returned to the bridge. The final checks were completed, the reactors were brought to a low hum, and the navigators fed the coordinates into the jump cores. The Admiral took one last look at the stars before the space in front of the fleet began to warp and tear. The jump was a violent, disorienting experience, the sensation of being squeezed through a needle's eye as the ship's internal gravity fluctuated wildly. When the Iron Sovereign finally emerged into real space, they were in the midst of a nightmare. The Oularian jump gate was a colossal structure, miles across, its surface a shifting kaleidoscope of light and shadow. Surrounding it were the Guardian ships, their crystalline hulls glowing with an ominous violet hue. The Terran fleet did not hesitate. As soon as the sensors cleared, Nathaniel gave the order to engage. The silence of the void was shattered by the discharge of thousands of mass drivers, the kinetic slugs streaking across the distance like lines of fire. The Oularian Guardians responded with blinding tachyon beams, the light so intense it overloaded the external cameras of the Terran ships. The battle was a chaotic, close-quarters brawl, a collision of two vastly different philosophies of war. The Iron Sovereign plowed through the Oularian formation, its forward shields absorbing punishment that would have vaporized a lesser ship. Nathaniel watched as a group of Terran destroyers swarmed an Oularian cruiser, their small size making them difficult targets for the enemy's heavy beams. They danced through the gaps in the Oularian defense, their rapid-fire cannons chewing through the crystalline armor until the enemy ship shattered into a million glowing shards. The target was the gate's central stabilizer, a massive pillar of light that anchored the structure to the underlying fabric of spacetime. Nathaniel directed the Iron Sovereign's primary weapon, a focused antimatter stream, at the base of the pillar. The beam was a streak of pure annihilation, a bridge of fire that connected the two civilizations in a moment of absolute violence. The Oularians tried to intercept the beam with their own energy fields, but the Terran fleet kept them pinned down, sacrificing their own hulls to keep the path clear. The stabilizer began to flicker, the light turning from violet to a sickly, unstable green. The gravitational fields around the gate began to collapse, pulling in nearby debris and Oularian ships alike. Nathaniel saw the opportunity and ordered the fleet to withdraw, their mission accomplished. As the Terran ships burned their engines to escape the growing singularity, the gate finally imploded, a silent roar of energy that lit up the outer system for 1,000 miles. The shockwave knocked the Iron Sovereign sideways, the internal alarms screaming as the hull groaned under the stress. But they were clear. The gate was gone, and the Oularian bridge to Sol had been severed. The return journey was a somber affair, the exhilaration of victory tempered by the reality of the losses they had sustained. Nearly a third of the strike force had been left behind, their names added to the growing list of the fallen. But as Nathaniel looked at the tactical maps, he knew they had bought themselves months, perhaps even a year of time. The Oularians would have to find another way to bridge the gap, and in that time, the Mandate would continue to grow, to innovate, and to harden. They had proven that the hegemony was not invincible, that their most advanced structures could be broken by the application of enough force and enough will. The Admiral sat in his cabin, the low hum of the ship's engines the only sound in the small space. He thought about the logistics of the next phase of the war, the need for more resources, more ships, and more people. He knew the crucible would only get hotter, that the demands on humanity would only increase. but he also knew that they were ready for it. They had found the resonance of iron and will, and it was a sound that would not be silenced. The galaxy was no longer a place of quiet observation. It was a battlefield, and humanity had just claimed its first victory on the road to the stars. The strategic silence, following the destruction of the Oularian jump gate, lasted only as long as it took for the hegemony to recalibrate its understanding of human spite. Inside the tactical briefing theater of the Iron Sovereign, Nathaniel Vance stood before a holographic star map that bled crimson where Terran sensor pings had gone dark. The Oularians were no longer treating the Sol system as a localized infestation to be purged by a single task force. They were shifting their entire regional posture to an encirclement doctrine. The intelligence gathered from the debris of the gate indicated that the crystalline invaders functioned on a collective harmonic frequency, a biological and technological integration that allowed their ships to act as a single, distributed consciousness. To defeat them, humanity could not simply rely on larger guns. They had to disrupt the very medium through which the hegemony projected its will. Nathaniel traced the projected vectors of the next Oularian wave, which was bypassing the traditional orbital planes and descending from the galactic north, a maneuver that ignored the gravitational wells of the outer planets entirely. This was a direct challenge to the Mandate's defensive grid, a reminder that the enemy possessed a mastery of spatial geometry that turned the vacuum of space into a three-dimensional playground of slaughter. The Mandate's response was the implementation of the kinetic threshold, a theoretical defense barrier composed of millions of autonomous railgun platforms hidden within the Uit cloud. These platforms, small and cold to avoid thermal detection, were the brainchild of an astrophysicist named Mek Soren, who had spent decades studying the orbital mechanics of rogue comets. Soren's design was a masterpiece of lethal simplicity. Each platform was essentially a massive capacitor attached to a tungsten slug, triggered by a sophisticated gravitic sensor that could detect the warp signature of an Oularian drive from light minutes away. Unlike the fleet engagements at Proxima, this was a war of invisible traps and silent predators. Nathaniel watched the first recorded engagement of the threshold on a secondary monitor. An Oularian scout group, shimmering with the iridescent glow of their refraction shields, tripped a sensor cluster near the Kuiper belt. Within milliseconds, 40 railgun platforms rotated on silent gimbals and unleashed a volley of slugs. The Oularians, accustomed to detecting active targeting sensors and energy buildups, were caught entirely off guard by the unpowered, cold-launched projectiles. 3 crystalline frigates were shattered into dust before they could even raise their primary combat envelopes, their elegant hulls proving brittle when faced with a localized saturation of hypervelocity metal. However, the hegemony was a quick study in the art of attrition. By the 3rd week of the encirclement, the Oularians began deploying shatter swarms, billions of microscopic mirror drones that acted as a physical and electromagnetic shield for their larger vessels. These swarms would intercept the kinetic slugs, sacrificing thousands of units to deflect a single projectile, effectively rendering the kinetic threshold a diminishing asset. Nathaniel realized that the war was transitioning into a phase of pure industrial output, where the winner would be determined by who could manufacture the tools of death faster than the other could destroy them. He ordered the Iron Sovereign to the asteroid belt, specifically the massive refinery complex on Ceres, which had become the beating heart of the Terran war effort. The station was a labyrinth of pressurized tunnels and smelting vats, where the temperature was kept at a constant, blistering level to facilitate the continuous casting of starship frames. The workers here lived in a state of permanent exhaustion, their shifts dictated by the arrival of ore freighters and the departure of newly commissioned destroyers. There was a desperate rhythm to the place, a metallic pulse that felt like the heartbeat of a species that had forgotten how to sleep. During his tour of the series' foundries, Nathaniel met with a group of frontline technicians who were modifying the standard-issue Terran missiles with resonance warheads. These experimental devices didn't rely on chemical explosives or nuclear fusion. Instead, they carried a specialized emitter designed to mimic the Oularian harmonic frequency. If a warhead could get close enough to an enemy hull, it would emit a high-frequency pulse that caused the crystalline lattice of the ship to vibrate until it reached its structural failure point. It was a weapon born of desperation and high-level physics, an attempt to turn the enemy's greatest strength, their unified crystalline structure, into a fatal flaw. The head technician, a veteran of the Jovian shipyards named Aris Thorne, explained that the resonance warheads were temperamental, requiring a precise lock on the specific harmonic signature of the target vessel. If the frequency was off by even a fraction of a hertz, the pulse would simply bounce off the shields with no effect. Nathaniel looked at the shimmering components of the warheads and saw the future of the war, a transition from brute force to a more surgical, intellectual form of violence. The Oularian countermove came with the suddenness of a lightning strike. They didn't target the fleet or the orbital stations, they targeted the atmosphere of Earth. Utilizing a series of long-range tachyon projectors positioned outside the range of the Mandate's sensors, they began a process of molecular stripping, targeting the ozone layer with concentrated beams of energy. It was a slow, agonizing method of genocide designed to render the homeworld uninhabitable without ever having to set foot on its surface. Nathaniel stood on the bridge of the Iron Sovereign as the reports came in from Geneva and Tokyo. The global temperature was rising, and the radiation levels on the surface were reaching lethal thresholds in the equatorial regions. The Oularians were forcing the Terran fleet to come out and fight on their terms, drawing them away from the fortified positions of the inner system and into the open void where the hegemony's superior range could be brought to bear. It was a classic pincer movement, a strategic trap that played on the most basic human instinct, the need to protect the cradle of their civilization. The Admiral knew he had to act, but he also knew that a direct charge against the tachyon projectors would be a slaughter. He gathered his tactical circle, including Mek Soren and Aris Thorne, to devise a counter-strategy that the hegemony's cold logic wouldn't anticipate. They developed a plan called the Black Mirror. It involved the use of the Iron Sovereign and its sister ships as bait, while a fleet of stealth-capable stealth mines and resonance drones moved through the shadow of the moon to flank the Oularian projectors. To hide the heat signatures of the flanking force, they would utilize a series of cold tow maneuvers, using the gravitational pull of passing comets to accelerate the drones without igniting their engines. It was a plan that relied on timing so precise that it left no room for error, a mechanical ballet performed across millions of miles of empty space. Nathaniel felt the tension in the room as the final coordinates were locked into the navigation computers. They were betting the survival of the species on a theory of resonance and the hope that the Oularians were too arrogant to look behind them. As the Iron Sovereign led the main fleet toward the Oularian projectors, the crystalline ships descended upon them like wolves on a fold. The space between the two forces became a chaotic web of violet tachyon beams and white-hot railgun tracers. The Terran ships took heavy damage, their armor melting and their internal systems failing as the Oularians pushed their energy weapons to the limit. Nathaniel sat in his command chair, his jaw clenched as he watched the casualty counts rise. Every minute they held the Oularians' attention was a minute Earth stayed alive, but the cost was being paid in the lives of his sailors. He saw the Relentless, a veteran cruiser from the Proxima campaign, vanish in a blinding flash as its antimatter containment failed under the stress of a sustained tachyon burst. He saw a swarm of human interceptors dive into the heart of the Oularian formation, their pilots engaging in suicidal maneuvers to disrupt the enemy's firing solutions. It was a spectacle of raw, unadulterated courage, a display of the human spirit that seemed to defy the very laws of entropy. Then the signal came from the flanking force. The resonance drones had reached their positions. On Nathaniel's command, the drones activated their emitters, flooding the area around the tachyon projectors with a discordant harmonic frequency. The effect was immediate and catastrophic for the Oularians. The crystalline structures of the projectors, designed to handle immense amounts of energy with perfect stability, began to groan and shatter. The violet beams flickered and died as the projectors tore themselves apart from the inside out. The Oularian fleet, suddenly deprived of their primary objective and suffering from the same resonance interference, fell into a state of tactical disarray. The Terran fleet seized the moment, pushing forward with a renewed ferocity. The resonance warheads, finally given a clear window of opportunity, found their marks. Crystalline ships that had previously seemed invincible suddenly disintegrated into clouds of fine dust as their internal structures were pulverized by the harmonic pulses. The battle of the projectors was a turning point, but it was not the end. As the remaining Oularian ships retreated into the depths of space, Nathaniel looked at the sensor readings for Earth. The molecular stripping had stopped, but the damage to the atmosphere was severe. It would take decades of terraforming and planetary engineering to repair the scars left by the hegemony's cruelty, but the homeworld was still there. The blue-green marble had survived another day, protected by the iron hulls and unbreakable will of its children. The Admiral felt a deep, hollow exhaustion, the kind that settles into the bones after a lifetime of struggle. He looked at his crew, their faces lit by the fading glow of the tactical displays, and saw the same exhaustion reflected in their eyes. They had won another battle, they had pushed back the shadow once more, but the galaxy was still cold, and the enemy was still vast. The hegemony would learn from this defeat as they had learned from the others. They would adapt their harmonics, they would shield their projectors, and they would return with a new method of destruction. But humanity had learned as well. They had learned that their ingenuity could match the hegemony's technology, that their willingness to sacrifice could overcome the hegemony's cold logic. They were no longer just a species fighting for survival. They were a species that had mastered the kinetic threshold, a race that could turn the very fabric of the universe into a weapon. As the Iron Sovereign began the long journey back to the lunar docks for repairs, Nathaniel Vance looked out at the stars and felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Not the naive hope of a child, but the hard, tempered hope of a soldier who knows the way is long, but the destination is certain. The resonance of iron and will was no longer just a sound. It was a promise, a vow written in the debris of shattered gods and the defiant breath of a world that refused to die. The logistics of the recovery began immediately. Even as the fires were being extinguished on the damaged ships, the orders were being sent out to the Martian foundries and the Jovian gas mines. They needed more resonance warheads, more stealth drones, more railgun platforms. The industry of the Mandate shifted once again, refining the lessons of the projector battle into new doctrines and new technologies. The people of Earth, looking up at a sky that was still recovering its natural hue, knew that their safety was bought with the blood of the fleet. A new sense of unity began to take root, a collective understanding that the survival of one was the survival of all. The artificial distinctions of nationality and culture were being forged into a single Terran identity, a shield of human diversity that was as strong as any crystalline alloy. Nathaniel Vance, standing on the observation deck of the lunar hub, watched the first of the new generation dreadnoughts being moved into its fitting-out berth. It was larger than the Iron Sovereign, its hull coated in a new type of ablative armor designed to dissipate tachyon energy. It was a beautiful, terrible machine, a testament to what humanity could achieve when pushed to the brink. The Admiral knew that the next time the hegemony came, they would find a galaxy that was no longer empty and silent, but filled with the thunder of 1,000 human engines and the unbreakable resonance of a will that would never falter. The Oularian Hegemony shifted its strategy from a war of attrition to a war of conceptual erasure, deploying a phenomenon the Terran Mandate categorized as a probability anchor. In the silent reaches between Jupiter and Saturn, space itself began to congeal into a state of heightened entropic stability, a localized zone where the fundamental laws of cause and effect were subtly manipulated to favor Oularian technology. Within this anchor, human mass drivers misfired with statistical impossibility, and the delicate containment fields of antimatter reactors suffered from spontaneous decoherence. Admiral Nathaniel Vance stood on the bridge of the Iron Sovereign, watching the telemetry from a forward scouting wing vanish into a wall of static and mathematical nonsense. The hegemony was no longer just firing beams of light. They were weaponizing the vacuum itself, turning the theater of war into a rigged game where humanity's kinetic brutality was being neutralized by a superior grasp of quantum mechanics. Nathaniel felt a cold, sharp clarity as he realized that the Mandate had hit a technological ceiling that could not be breached by industrial output alone. They needed to find a way to operate within the anchor, to project human will into a space that was actively trying to dissolve the very concept of human agency. The scientific response was led by a theoretical physicist named Sarah Vane, who had spent her life studying the observer effect in quantum systems. She theorized that the Oularian probability anchor relied on a collective, machine-driven consciousness to maintain its state of artificial order. If a sufficiently chaotic and unpredictable variable were introduced into the field, the anchor would lose its coherence, collapsing back into standard spacetime. This variable could not be a computer program or a preset tactical algorithm, as those were predictable by the hegemony's advanced modeling suites. It had to be the human mind itself, unfiltered, irrational, and fueled by the raw necessity of survival. Vane proposed the Icarus Protocol, a system that would wire a human pilot directly into the ship's tactical and navigational arrays, bypassing the digital buffers that the Oularians were so adept at hacking. It was a fusion of biology and machinery that turned the ship into an extension of the pilot's central nervous system, a desperate gamble to outthink a god by becoming a monster. Nathaniel looked at the schematics and saw a machine that would consume the person inside it, a cockpit that functioned more like a sarcophagus of high-speed data. The first prototype of the Icarus-linked interceptors was tested in the shadow of Titan. The pilot was a veteran named Marcus Thorne, a man who had survived 3 separate hull breaches and possessed a record of tactical improvisation that bordered on the suicidal. As the neural needles engaged with his spine, the Iron Sovereign's sensors recorded a spike in brain activity that transcended anything seen in human history. Thorne wasn't just flying the ship, he was the ship. When he entered the edge of the probability anchor, the Oularian distortion fields attempted to force his systems into a state of failure. But Thorne's mind, a chaotic storm of memories, instincts, and adrenaline, pushed back. The ship's engines flared with an irregular, pulsing rhythm that defied the Oularian logic nets. He moved with a stuttering, nonlinear grace, appearing to be in 3 places at once as his subjective perception of time dilated under the pressure of the link. He didn't just fire at the Oularian Guardians, he predicted their defensive shifts by sensing the ripples in the probability field before they manifested. In a matter of minutes, Thorne had dismantled an entire Oularian picket line, his movements so erratic and violent that the Hegemony's automated turrets couldn't even achieve a target lock. However, the cost of the Icarus Protocol was written in the neurological ruin of the pilots. After only 20 minutes of combat, Thorne was pulled from the cockpit in a state of catatonic shock, his mind unable to disconnect from the vast, cold silence of the vacuum he had just inhabited. Nathaniel Vance visited the medical bay, looking down at the shell of one of his best men. He saw the marks of the interface, the charred skin, and the hollow eyes of someone who had seen too much of the underlying machinery of the universe. Yet even in this state, Thorne's hand was twitching in a rhythmic pattern, the manual override code for a mass driver. The human spirit was refusing to let go, even when the brain had been scorched by the effort of defiance. This was the terrifying reality of the new war. Humanity was winning not through better machines, but by burning through its own people like fuel in a furnace. The Admiral felt a deep, gnawing guilt, but it was overshadowed by the grim necessity of the moment. The Oularians were moving their main anchor toward Earth's orbital path. If it reached the atmosphere, the planet's weather patterns would be locked into a permanent, frozen stasis, and the biosphere would cease to function within a week. The Mandate launched the Shatterpoint Offensive, a full-scale deployment of Icarus-linked ships led by the Iron Sovereign herself. Nathaniel had the interface installed on the command bridge, not for a pilot, but for himself. He needed the tactical overview that only the link could provide, the ability to see the probability anchor not as a wall of static, but as a series of fragile nodes. As the needles sank into his neck, the world dissolved into a shimmering tapestry of vectors and possibilities. He felt the ship's hull as if it were his own skin, the vibration of the fusion reactors a dull throb in his chest. He saw the Oularian fleet as a cold, crystalline lattice of perfect order, a beautiful and stagnant thing that had no room for the messy, vibrant chaos of life. He gave the order to engage, and his voice wasn't just a sound, it was a command that rippled through the neural links of every pilot in the fleet. They moved as a single, jagged blade, a swarm of individual wills united by a singular purpose. The battle within the probability anchor was a hallucinatory nightmare. The stars seemed to stretch and bleed across the sky, and the Oularian ships flickered in and out of existence like ghosts. The Iron Sovereign took a direct hit from a tachyon lance, but Nathaniel didn't wait for the damage reports. He felt the breach in the secondary cooling loop and rerouted power through the emergency shunts with a thought, his mind moving faster than any automated system. He saw the central node of the anchor, a massive, spinning polyhedron of pure energy that acted as the heart of the Oularian distortion field. It was protected by a sphere of absolute zero, a thermal barrier that would shatter any metal that touched it. Nathaniel signaled the Icarus pilots to form a resonance chain. By synchronizing their brainwaves through the fleet's comlink, they created a feedback loop of human consciousness that began to vibrate against the stability of the anchor. It was a psychic scream translated into the language of physics, a rejection of the Oularian order that resonated through the very fabric of space. The Oularian collective felt the intrusion. For the first time in their history, The hegemony experienced a sensation akin to fear, not the fear of death, but the fear of incoherence. The human presence was a poison to their perfect logic, an infection of spontaneity that threatened to unravel their entire civilization. They turned every weapon they had on the Iron Sovereign, the space around the dreadnought becoming a solid wall of violet fire. Nathaniel felt the pain of every hit, the searing heat of the tachyon beams, and the jarring impact of the gravitational shears. He held the line, his mind anchored by the memory of the blue world behind him, the faces of the millions who were counting on this one desperate moment. He saw the node begin to crack, the probability field fluctuating as the human resonance reached its peak. With a final, agonizing effort, he pushed the Iron Sovereign forward, using the ship's own mass as a hammer to shatter the thermal barrier. The collapse of the probability anchor was a cataclysm of light and sound that transcended the vacuum. The artificial order of the Oularians snapped like a dry twig, and the resulting release of energy vaporized the central node and every enemy ship within 10,000 miles. The Iron Sovereign was thrown backward, its hull buckled and its systems dark. Inside the command bridge, the neural link severed with a violent jolt, throwing Nathaniel to the deck. He lay there for a long time, gasping for air that tasted of ozone and blood, his mind slowly reassembling itself from the fragments of the cosmic perspective he had just held. He looked up to see the tactical display flickering back to life. The Oularian fleet was gone, leaving only a shimmering cloud of crystalline dust. Earth was safe, and the stars were once again just stars, distant and silent, and governed by the laws of a universe that belonged to no one. The aftermath of the Shatterpoint offensive left the Mandate's fleet a collection of drifting wrecks, but the psychological victory was absolute. The Oularians had been beaten at their own game. Their most advanced metaphysical weapon had been broken by the sheer, unrefined power of the human psyche. Nathaniel Vance was eventually helped to his feet, his body trembling with the aftereffects of the Icarus link. He knew he would never be the same, that a part of him would always remain out there in the dark, touching the edges of the infinite. But he also knew that humanity had found its ultimate edge. They were no longer just a species of toolmakers and soldiers. They were a race of observers who could rewrite the rules of reality through the strength of their will. The resonance of iron and will had reached its singularity, a point where the distinction between the two had vanished. As the rescue shuttles began to arrive, the Admiral looked out at the debris of the Oularian Hegemony and realized that the war had changed. It was no longer a struggle for territory or resources. It was a fight for the right to be unpredictable, to be flawed, and to be free. The hegemony would return, but they would find a species that had tasted the power of the stars and found it wanting compared to the fire of the human heart. The victory at the probability anchor had come at a cost that the United Terran Mandate could not measure in hulls or currency, but in the collective stability of its survivors. Admiral Nathaniel Vance stood in the observation gallery of the Aegis of Mankind, a newer, sturdier successor to the broken Iron Sovereign. His vision occasionally blurred with the phantom overlays of the Icarus link, a persistent neurological echo that made the solid steel of the deck feel as translucent as a dream. The Oularian Hegemony, reeling from the psychic shock of the Shatterpoint, had retreated to the Jovian periphery, but they had not fled the system. Instead, they were consolidating their remaining strength into a singular, massive structure near the Great Red Spot. It was a world forge, a celestial engine designed to harvest the metallic hydrogen of the gas giant to construct a moon-sized fortress. The Oularians were no longer trying to bypass humanity. They were building a permanent, indestructible presence within the Sol system, a monument to their refusal to be evicted. Nathaniel watched the long-range telemetric feeds, seeing the massive crystalline tendrils of the forge dipping into the turbulent storms of Jupiter, sucking the lifeblood of a planet to fuel their final vengeance. The Mandate's tactical council was divided. Some argued for a defensive posture, a wall of iron around Earth and Mars to wait out the Oularian construction. But Nathaniel knew that the World Forge was not just a shipyard, it was a gravitational weapon. As it gained mass, it would begin to destabilize the orbits of the outer moons, creating a chaotic chain reaction that would eventually send the asteroid belt spiraling into the inner system. This was the gravity of heritage, a realization that to protect their future, humanity had to reclaim the very giants that had shielded the Earth from cosmic debris for eons. The Admiral summoned the last of the Icarus pilots, a group of men and women who walked with the hollow, measured gait of the ghost-bound. They were the only ones who could navigate the crushing gravitational gradients of Jupiter's atmosphere, where the pressure was enough to turn carbon into diamonds and steel into foil. They were the spearhead of Project Vulcan, a desperate plan to inject a viral catalytic agent into the World Forge's primary intake, turning the Oularians' own harvesting process into a catastrophic meltdown. The catalytic agent was the work of a chemist named Elena Thorne, who had spent months analyzing the crystalline bonds of Oularian alloy. She had discovered that the material was hypersensitive to specific isotopes of deuterium. If the World Forge could be tricked into drawing in a contaminated stream of hydrogen, the resulting reaction would cause the crystalline structure to undergo a process of molecular rot, losing its structural integrity in a matter of seconds. The challenge was delivery. The intake was located at the heart of a gravitational vortex, protected by a fleet of Oularian interceptors that functioned as a living shield. Nathaniel looked at the mission profile and knew it was a one-way journey. The ships would have to dive into the crushing depths of Jupiter, using the planet's own gravity to accelerate to speeds that no human could survive without the Icarus link to manage the inertial dampeners. It was a test of the very limits of human biology and engineering, a final descent into the crucible of the King of Planets. As the aegis of mankind approached the Jovian system, the sheer scale of the Oularian ambition became clear. The World Forge was a shimmering web of light and crystal that spanned thousands of kilometers, anchored by massive tethers that disappeared into the roiling orange and white clouds of the gas giant. The Oularian fleet was arranged in a concentric sphere around the forge, their tachyon beams creating a cage of violet energy that warned off any approach. Nathaniel felt the familiar hum of the Icarus needles as he prepared to lead the strike himself. He knew the doctors had warned him that another deep sink could lead to permanent cognitive collapse, but he also knew that he was the only one with the experience to coordinate the fleet's movements through the chaotic gravity wells. As the link engaged, his consciousness expanded once more, touching the cold, immense presence of Jupiter. The planet felt like a living entity, a massive, swirling consciousness of pressure and storm, and the Oularians were a parasite clinging to its skin. The descent was a violent, screaming journey into the abyss. The Terran ships, their hulls reinforced with the latest ablative ceramics, began to glow with the heat of atmospheric entry. The gravity of Jupiter pulled at them with a relentless, crushing force. The formula for gravitational acceleration G equals G\frac mr2, becoming a tangible weight that threatened to snap their spines. Nathaniel directed the fleet into a gravity slingshot, using a precise orbital window to swing around the moon of Io and pick up the velocity needed to punch through the Oularian defensive sphere. The Hegemony ships fired, their beams refracted by the dense Jovian atmosphere into beautiful, lethal curtains of light. The Terran cruisers returned fire, their mass drivers accelerated by the planet's own pull, the slugs hitting with the force of tactical nuclear weapons. It was a battle fought in a landscape of liquid metallic hydrogen and horizontal lightning bolts that were miles long. The Aegis took the lead, its forward shields flaring as it plowed through the Oularian interceptors. Nathaniel felt every impact as a sharp pain in his mind, but he pushed it aside, focusing on the intake of the World Forge. He could see the massive suction vortex, a swirling maw that was drawing in the hydrogen gas like a titan drinking from an ocean. He signaled the delivery ships, a wing of small, Icarus-linked drones carrying the catalytic agent. They dived into the vortex, their pilots screaming over the comms as the pressure began to crush their small hulls. One by one, the drones were lost to the storm, but not before they released their payloads. The contaminated hydrogen was drawn into the forge's primary reactors, and for a moment, the massive structure seemed to shudder. A ripple of sickly, pale green light began to spread across the crystalline tethers, the molecular rot eating through the Oularian alloy with terrifying speed. The Hegemony realized their mistake too late. The World Forge, no longer able to maintain its structural integrity against the immense gravity of Jupiter, began to buckle. The tethers snapped with a sound that could be felt through the hulls of the Terran ships, a deep, resonant groan of a dying giant. The forge began to sink into the atmosphere, its massive components collapsing in on themselves as they descended into the high-pressure layers of the planet. The Oularian fleet, caught in the wake of the collapsing forge, was dragged down with it, their elegant hulls no match for the crushing depths of the gas giant. Nathaniel watched the destruction with a cold, detached satisfaction. The Oularians had tried to master the gravity of Sol, but they had forgotten that the humans were the ones who had grown up in its shadow. They were a species of the gravity well, born of the dirt and the stone, and they knew better than anyone how to turn the weight of a world into a weapon. The escape from Jupiter's gravity was a grueling, agonizing climb. The Aegis was battered, its engines sputtering as it fought against the planet's relentless pull. Nathaniel held the link open, his mind a frayed wire of sheer willpower, guiding the remnants of the fleet back toward the safety of the vacuum. As they finally broke through the upper cloud layers and into the blackness of space, the Admiral felt the link sever. He didn't fall this time. He simply sat in his chair, his eyes fixed on the receding orange globe of Jupiter. The World Forge was gone, swallowed by the planet it had tried to exploit. The Hegemony's presence in the outer system had been broken, and the threat of the gravitational collapse had been averted. But as he looked at the sensor logs, he saw that of the 50 ships that had followed him into the clouds, only 12 had returned. The cost of their heritage was a heavy one, a debt paid in the lives of those who had dared to challenge the King of Planets. Nathaniel Vance was eventually taken to the medical bay, where the doctors worked to stabilize his nervous system. He was told that he would never be able to use the Icarus link again, that his mind had reached its absolute threshold. He accepted the news with a quiet nod. He had done his part. He had led his people through the fire and the storm, and he had proven that the human spirit was stronger than any crystalline alloy or machine logic. The resonance of iron and will had stood against the gravity of the stars and emerged victorious. As the Aegis of mankind limped back toward the inner system, the Admiral looked out at the distant, pale blue dot of Earth. It was a small, fragile thing in a vast and dangerous universe, but it was theirs. It was the source of their strength, the foundation of their heritage, and as long as they remembered the weight of the world they had come from, they would never be truly defeated. The war was not over, but the Oularians had learned a valuable lesson. You do not try to build a home in the house of a giant, especially when the giant's children are watching. the aftermath of the Jovian campaign saw a shift in the Mandate's philosophy. They began to integrate the lessons of Project Vulcan into all their defensive structures, building gravity anchors and pressure hulls that could survive in the most extreme environments of the solar system. They were no longer just defending their worlds, they were claiming the entire system as their fortress. The Oularians had inadvertently taught them how to use the very geography of their home as a shield and a sword. On Mars, the factories were being retooled to produce the catalytic agents on an industrial scale, and on Earth, a new generation of pilots was being trained, not to replace the Icarus veterans, but to build on their legacy. The resonance was growing, a steady, rhythmic pulse that echoed from the sun to the furthest reaches of the Oort cloud. Nathaniel Vance, resting in a quiet garden on Luna, watched the ships moving through the sky and knew that the future was in good hands. They had found their iron, they had proved their will, and now they were learning the true meaning of their heritage. The Oularian Hegemony finally understood that humanity was not a biological variable to be accounted for, but a fundamental disruption of the galactic order. In a final, desperate move to preserve their logic of dominance, the Hegemony mobilized their entire remaining armada, 1,000,000 ships strong, not for a tactical strike, but for a total system siege. They arrived at the heliopause like a shimmering wall of crystalline fire, their presence so immense that the distortion of their mass warps could be felt by every gravitational sensor, from Pluto to Mercury. Admiral Nathaniel Vance, now stripped of the ability to link with the Icarus arrays, but possessing a tactical mind sharpened by the very fires that had scarred him, stood in the central command nexus of the newly christened dreadnought Sol Invictus. This vessel was the pinnacle of human engineering, a 10-mile-long cathedral of industrial spite, powered by a triple-redundant singularity core and armored with the very ceramic metallic alloys forged in the Jovian depths. Behind him lay the united strength of the Terran Mandate, a fleet of 60,000 ships that looked like a handful of gravel against the Oularian mountain. Yet every human soul aboard those vessels was vibrating with the same frequency of defiance that had shattered the probability anchor. The Oularian High Command did not send a message of surrender or a demand for parley. They sent a logic plague, a high-bandwidth data burst designed to overwrite the operating systems of human technology and the neural pathways of anyone still connected to a ship's network. But the Mandate had expected this final move. They had spent the months since Jupiter air-gapping their critical systems and transitioning to analog reactive controls. The Sol Invictus didn't rely on a central AI. It relied on thousands of human operators using mechanical overrides and hardwired circuits. When the logic plague hit, it washed over the Terran fleet like a wave against a cliff of basalt. The crystalline ships, confused by the lack of digital response, were forced to close the distance for a traditional kinetic engagement. Nathaniel looked at the massive tactical hololith, seeing the Oularian wall begin to fragment into localized strike groups. He knew this was the moment. The Hegemony had abandoned their elegance for raw numbers, and in doing so, they had stepped onto the field where humanity reigned supreme, the art of the brutal, chaotic, and unyielding struggle for the next inch of ground. The engagement began at the orbit of Saturn, the ringed planet serving as the backdrop for the largest naval battle in the history of the galaxy. The Oularians unleashed their Star Eaters, massive orbital arrays designed to focus the sun's own energy into a beam of solar plasma. But the Terran fleet didn't retreat. They used the shield wall formation, a revolutionary tactic where the larger dreadnoughts interlocked their magnetic fields to create a planetary-scale deflector. The solar plasma was redirected, splashed harmlessly into the vacuum, or harvested by the Sol Invictus's own power siphons to overcharge its mass drivers. Nathaniel gave the order for Saturation Alpha. Every human ship, from the smallest interceptor to the massive carriers, unleashed their entire magazine of kinetic slugs, resonance warheads, and antimatter torpedoes in a single synchronized heartbeat. The space between the fleets was instantly filled with 1 billion tons of metal traveling at relativistic speeds. The Oularian forward line didn't just break, it ceased to exist, turned into a cloud of iridescent vapor by the sheer weight of the human response. Despite the initial success, the sheer weight of Oularian numbers began to tell. For every crystalline ship destroyed, 10 more moved to take its place. The Sol Invictus was surrounded, its hull glowing white-hot as thousands of tachyon beams focused on its primary shields. Nathaniel felt the vibration of the deck through his boots, a rhythmic thrumming that matched the pounding of his own heart. He saw the aegis of mankind take a fatal blow, its structure collapsing into the rings of Saturn, creating a new belt of steel and ice. He saw the Icarus pilots, their minds burning out in real time, pushing their ships into suicidal collisions to keep the Oularian world breakers away from the inner system. It was a scene of absolute carnage, a testament to the fact that the universe did not care for heroics or hope. It only cared for the persistence of mass and the endurance of will. But the Terran soul was a thing of infinite persistence. Even as their ships were torn apart, the survivors continued to fire their manual turrets, their shouts of defiance echoing through the dying comm channels. Nathaniel realized that to win, they had to decapitate the Hegemony's collective. He identified the apex node, a massive, obsidian black vessel hidden at the center of the Oularian formation. This was the source of their coordination, the central nervous system of the million-ship swarm. He ordered the Sol Invictus to execute a full-burn charge, dumping all remaining fuel into the main thrusters and disabling the internal inertial dampeners. It was a maneuver that would kill most of the crew from the sheer G-force, but it was the only way to reach the apex node before the Terran fleet was completely annihilated. As the dreadnought accelerated, the world became a blur of red and black. Nathaniel felt his ribs crack under the pressure, his lungs struggling to pull in air as the ship reached 40 gravities of acceleration. Around them, the Oularian ships tried to intercept, but the Sol Invictus was a 10-mile hammer of iron, smashing through the crystalline vessels as if they were made of glass. When the Sol Invictus finally slammed into the apex node, the impact was not an explosion, but a fusion of two civilizations. The human ship's prow, reinforced with the Jovian alloys, buried itself deep into the heart of the Oularian command hub. Nathaniel, barely conscious and bleeding from his eyes, crawled toward the manual detonator for the ship's singularity core. He didn't need a neural link to know what to do. He didn't need a computer to tell him the probability of success. He simply reached out and gripped the iron lever, his hand steady even as the ship around him began to dissolve. He thought of the blue-green marble, the red dust of Mars, and the cold, hard work of the series' foundries. He thought of the billions of people who had lived and died so that he could stand in this moment, at the zenith of the human soul. With a final, defiant smile, he pulled the lever, triggering a localized collapse of the singularity core that didn't just destroy the apex node, but sent a shockwave of incoherence through the entire Oularian collective. The death of the apex node was the end of the hegemony. Without their central coordination, the million ships became nothing more than drifting, mindless crystals. The Oularian swarm, once a terrifying force of perfect order, shattered into 1 trillion disconnected fragments. The remaining Terran ships, battered and broken but still functional, began the long process of mopping up the remnants. The Battle of Saturn was over, and the Oularian threat was extinguished forever. Humanity had not just survived. They had proven that a species built on the foundation of individual will and shared sacrifice could overcome any technology, any logic, and any god. The vacuum was silent once more, but it was a silence filled with the echoes of the fallen and the promise of a new era. The resonance of iron and will had reached its final, triumphant crescendo, a sound that would define the galaxy for 1,000 years to come. In the years that followed, the Sol system became a monument to the Great Defiance. The debris of the Oularian fleet was used to build a ring of habitats and shipyards that spanned the entire inner system, a Terran halo that ensured no enemy would ever threaten the homeworld again. Nathaniel Vance's name was etched into the hull of every ship in the new fleet, a reminder of the man who had looked into the abyss and made it blink. The Icarus Protocol was retired, replaced by a new form of human-machine integration that prioritized the health and sanity of the pilot, a lesson learned from the cost of the war. Humanity began to spread out into the stars, not as conquerors, but as a species that knew the value of life and the power of the soul. They were no longer the children of a single planet. They were the guardians of a philosophy that stated, quite simply, that the universe belonged to those who were willing to fight for their right to exist. The ruins of the World Forge on Jupiter were turned into a research station, where scientists from across the colonies studied the crystalline technology of the hegemony, integrating its power efficiency with the brutal reliability of human engineering. The galaxy was no longer a place of mystery and fear, but a frontier to be explored and understood. The resonance continued, a steady, pulsing beat that could be felt in the vibration of every hull and the heartbeat of every human. It was the sound of a species that had found its place in the cosmos, a race of iron and will that had reached the zenith of its potential and found that there was no limit to what they could achieve. The shadow had been cast out, and in its place, the light of humanity shone brighter than any star, a beacon of hope and defiance for all who would come after. As the sun of Sol set over the lunar docks, a new class of explorership prepared to depart for the Andromeda Galaxy. Its hull was a mix of dark steel and shimmering crystal, a fusion of the two powers that had fought for the soul of the system. On its bridge, a young commander looked out at the stars, feeling the faint, persistent thrum of the engines beneath his feet. He knew the stories of Vance and Thorn, of the probability anchor and the Jovian descent. He knew that the peace he enjoyed was bought with the blood of giants. He took a deep breath, adjusted his collar, and gave the order to engage the jump drive. The ship vanished into the void, leaving behind a trail of artificial light that lingered in the darkness like a promise. The resonance of iron and will was no longer just a war cry. It was the anthem of a species that had finally, truly, come home to the stars. The Admiral's legacy lived on not just in the history books, but in the very way humanity approached the unknown. They no longer feared the dark, for they knew they carried the fire within them. They no longer bowed to superior technology, for they knew that the most powerful machine in the universe was the human heart. The hegemony was a memory, a cautionary tale of what happens when logic is divorced from empathy and order is placed above agency. Humanity was the future, a messy, loud, unpredictable, and beautiful future that would echo across the light years until the end of time. The resonance was complete, a perfect harmony of strength and spirit that would never be silenced.